please feel free to drop questions in the chat at any time because we have our wonderful guest, Shahid Buttar, who is running for Nancy Pelosi's seat in Congress. Do you want to start off with an introduction before we start with questions?
Sure, yeah. My name's Shahid. I'm really excited to be with you all. I'm really grateful for all the work that you're each doing in your communities here in California, and for those of you joining from other places around the country. I really see the voices of youth in the climate justice movement as the voices of moral leadership that are holding accountable our institutions that have been long dedicated to corporations before communities. And I'm eager not to see our future run off a cliff. I'm grateful for the invitation to join you all today and all the work that you're doing to force this conversation on a recalcitrant Congress. And I'm eager to join the body and be an ally inside the institutions as I have been on the outside before.
Okay, so the first question, I think you kind of explained it, but for the people that aren't familiar with you, could you please explain your platform?
Sure, thank you, Maggie. I'm running as a democratic socialist, so very much a voice from the left of the mainstream Democratic Party, alternatively a voice from the future, defending, for instance, issues and values including intergenerational sustainability, climate justice, universal health care, and human rights. I like to say that my brand of democratic socialism is particularly anti-authoritarian. As an immigrant to the United States, I take very seriously a number of principles that I think many Americans take for granted, including democracy, our rights, transparency, congressional oversight. These seem like very tepid values relative to the more ambitious ones of expanding human rights to include human needs and nationalizing fossil fuel industries, shrinking the Pentagon, ending mass incarceration. I want to do all those things too. At the same time, my democratic socialism, I say, often emphasizes the D because I see our democracy very much under a multi-vector assault. And the work that I've done over the last 20 years has been most prolific in the context of challenging government secrecy and defending civil liberties from government surveillance and CIA torture, state violence in the context of policing. Other issues I've had a chance to work on in the past include getting money out of politics, establishing marriage equality for same-sex couples. I had a chance to represent the second mayor in our country who supported and acknowledged the right of consenting adults to marry a partner of their choice. His name is Jason West. He was the elected mayor of New Paltz, New York. I'm proud of that work, and I would say that it, beyond the platform, indicates the character of the alternative that my campaign offers San Francisco. In 2004, as a young lawyer, without any privilege, as a cis hetero Muslim from the rural Midwest, I was fighting in the courts for marriage equality because I recognize that rights and oppressions are intersectional. It took Speaker Pelosi, with all of the institutional privilege of being the Speaker of the House as the elected representative of the country's gay mecca, it took her another 10 years to officially endorse and support marriage equality for same-sex couples. And I am a voice that has always tried to fight for the future. It's always fought for human rights. I've never put my career first. I've always done unpopular things to do what the right thing is, precisely, frankly, why I would never contemplate running for Congress until Bernie Sanders in 2016 proved that I am far from alone, and none of us are alone in wanting to put people before profit and putting our communities before corporations. That's a little bit about my platform and a little bit about the work I've done. Happy to, dive into any piece of that might be interesting.
You kind of touched on this a little bit in that answer, but can you expand on kind of what inspired you to start your congressional run?
Thanks, Priyanka. I appreciate that question too. I would describe my congressional run as motivated as much by frustration as it was by aspiration. So I've been, for 20 years, a constitutional lawyer fighting for progressive politics here in San Francisco, in Washington, D.C., and at the local and the state level across the country. I led a nonprofit for 6 years. I represented members of Congress in court. I've briefed members of Congress at their invitations about proposed surveillance reforms. I've been arrested in the Senate for an act of journalism. I've kind of done all the things one can do. I've produced hip hop history music lessons. I've done banner drops. I've done light brigades. I've shut down cities in direct action. And as a constituent of Nancy Pelosi's, for 20 years, I have seen her misrepresent our city and place executive power and executive secrecy before human rights, place corporate resource extraction and military industrial plunder before the rights of indigenous communities and peace and justice and climate justice. And I've seen her stand in the way even of recognizing the rights of immigrants, which are an object of profound and widespread local consensus. And what ultimately motivated me to run for Congress was recognizing how long-standing my frustrations had grown, and recognizing also that I, to some extent, have been freakishly prepared to challenge a figure who has co-opted the party that represents itself to the public as representing working people. And to see a wealthy millionaire landlord lead the Democratic Party to the right, as Speaker Pelosi has done, for me is simply intolerable. And as I looked around, hoping that someone else would run to remove her and replace her and give San Francisco a more faithful representation of our city's voice, I recognized that no one else was going to do it. At the end of the day, we are all the leaders that we have been waiting for, and having run a nonprofit and understanding how to formulate policy and coach a staff and talk to media sources and raise money, having worked in organizing and direct action for 20 years, knowing how to inspire people and motivate them and recruit teams and set agendas, it seemed to me increasingly as I grew more and more frustrated with Pelosi that I couldn't just watch our city's voice in Washington continuing to undermine our city's interests in Congress. And I would just say at the end of the day, my frustration at some point eclipsed my sense of political self-preservation. And that was the point at which I jumped in the race. That was spring 2018. This is my second cycle. So I'm now basically on the third year of my campaign. And I'm very grateful for the tens of thousands of people around the country who've donated to our campaign, who are volunteering with us, who supported us in other ways. And it's really a function of all that support that's put us in the position. I will be this November the first Democrat that Nancy Pelosi has ever faced in a general election in 30 years. And that's very much a reflection of the broad base of support that we've received and attracted. And I'm very grateful for all that support.
Yeah, so I know that earlier you kind of touched on how your identity as somebody who's Muslim and as an immigrant has kind of shaped your politics. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Thanks, Supriya. That's a great question. And I'll try to answer it historically. The point at which my background really became relevant to my politics was the point at which my background became relevant to seemingly everyone else. I grew up as a model minority in the Midwest. I came to study law at Stanford. That's how I got to the Bay Area in 2000. And it wasn't long after that first the Bush versus Gore decision happened, and that sort of forced me into politics and forced my alarm about the delegitimation, let's say, of our institutional framework. And it was not long after that we found ourselves grappling with the first of a whole series of government measures since then, eroding privacy and placing at risk vulnerable communities. I'm thinking particularly of the Patriot Act. Some years later, I had a chance to launch the program to combat racial and religious profiling at a then startup nonprofit called Muslim Advocates. I was the first staff counsel in that program there. And in each of these roles, and then later when I was running the Bill of Rights Defense Committee before joining the Electronic Frontier Foundation, I found myself fighting executive power run amok. And there's a difference between the fears of dystopia that someone might have as a democracy activist versus the fears of dystopia that one might have as a member of a vulnerable minority whose family literally has been fleeing across the globe different versions of authoritarianism for 50 years. So, I belong to a religious sect of Islam that is reviled as heretical in Muslim countries. We're sort of like Unitarian Universalists in Islam. We acknowledge, prophecy from different faith traditions. That's enough to make us very unpopular in the land that my parents came from in Pakistan. So they fled to go to England in the 60s. And then the racial discrimination towards South Asians in England is sufficiently profound that my parents felt the need to come to the United States to seek greater racial opportunity. And ironically, we found it in rural Missouri, where as a brown immigrant, we were very eagerly welcomed by our neighbors. And I recognize in retrospect a great deal of privilege in that experience. I don't know if someone with our skin tone and history would experience the same homecoming that we had an opportunity to discover in Missouri. But it was particularly while I was at Stanford in the wake of the 9/11 attacks that my racial identity was very immediately reconceptualized by the body public. And I think a lot of people have the experience of our racial identities and implications shifting very dramatically in that time slice. And, you know, I can certainly, you know, remember any number of dirty looks in public, any number of, you know, I can think of a distinct moment being outside the White House in Washington, D.C. as part of a protest, and hearing someone driving down 17th Street yelling out their truck window, you know, "Go home, Osama," and recognizing this way in which we as people of color, particularly immigrants, and perhaps particularly Muslims, have been canaries in the constitutional coal mine of the United States. I have skin in the game. I understand what authoritarianism looks like because I've seen the chilling effects on speech driven by government surveillance measures that have targeted my community. And not just my community. Quakers have been targeted. Animal rights activists have been targeted. Environmental activists have been targeted. And it's an interesting thing then to sort of bring this, my response to Supriya's question full circle. It's the very same thing that drove me to defend the rights of religious minorities targeted, for instance, by particularly FBI monitoring and infiltration of First Amendment protected spaces. That very same work is what brought me in connection with the activists responding to the Green Scare and the criminalization of environmental activists under the Clinton administration in the 90s. You know, a lot of people have this false narrative that the contemporary constitutional crisis started on September 11th, 2001. And it's not true. Unfortunately, in the United States, we were jailing dissidents as terrorists 10 years before that. It started under the Clinton administration, and the first wave of Americans detained as terrorists because of their speech crimes were environmentalists. And I do often think, how different might our environmental policy look? How different might our energy policy look? How different might any number of things look if we actually embraced First Amendment values and let dissidents speak, rather than criminalizing speech as our government has for entirely too long. And at the same time that my faith community and my ethnic community and the broader community of immigrants have been targets in that grand enterprise of dissent suppression masquerading as security theater, I've seen environmentalists also unfortunately bear the brunt of the very same agenda. And I'm concerned in both dimensions, both as an immigrant and as a Muslim and as an environmentalist. Across each of those identities, I'm concerned. And it is the intersection among them that drives me to the work.
Thank you for speaking on that. And I didn't even know about the environmental activists part. And I think that's important for our movement today to recognize, is that we have privilege because we are generally not facing a ton of jail time or being arrested, putting our bodies on the line. And that does have to do with the fact that, like, currently, you know, our strikes are kind of, you know, often we have permits, they're kind of a little bit performative. And what we're trying to do in the future is work on more direct action, work on more, you know, kind of putting more of our bodies on the line, because we do have the 10 years and in remembrance of the environmental activists that did get jailed for being dissidents. And connecting that point is to one of my questions. It's actually about when you spoke at our Silicon Valley September 20th rally last year. Yeah. I remember you made this point about abolishing the CIA, and afterwards, the moms, actually, I mostly heard this from moms, but they were so, I guess, pressed about it. And, like, I guess, what would you say is, like, the need for a lot of mainstream neoliberals to understand about the intersections of, like, the military industrial complex with the climate justice and overall, like, every justice movement?
Thank you, Helen. You guys have great questions. I'm so honored to have a chance to embrace this dialogue at this level. Maybe just one thing I'll bridge to your question you raised before, that the history from the 90s was new to some of you. Is that true for others? Because I would love to just share a few. Okay, so let me just give you a few search terms to read about and learn more independently. One of them is the AETA. That stands for the Animal Enterprise Terrorism Act. It was a key statute enacted in the 90s that criminalized speech, and it was particularly targeting animal rights activists, were the first wave to get targeted. Another search term to just explore is Judy Berry. I think her last name is spelled B-A-R-I. She is an environmental activist, was an environmental activist from here in the Bay Area, who won a $4 million judgment against the FBI after the Bureau bombed her car and tried to blame it on her. So when you say that you have the privilege of not facing severe risks, just realize, and she wasn't a long time ago, that was the 90s, right? So like when we talk about the era of organizers confronting risks, these are not long ago phenomenon. I mean, across the world, Earth defenders face very profound risks today. I'm thinking about Berta Cáceres, for instance, an environmental Earth defender, a recipient of the Goldman Award, who was murdered for defending Earth rights. Like these are issues that pit us individually and collectively against, and this gets to the question you were raising, Helen, against an international resource extraction machine that we were warned to fear by its architect. So maybe let's take a minute or two. I'd love to dive into that question a bit. I have a chapter in a book, Project Censored, issues an annual volume. And in the 2017 edition, I have a chapter titled Ike's Dystopian Dream. And Ike is a reference to a former president, Dwight Eisenhower. He was the supreme Allied commander of the victorious Allied forces that won the Second World War before he became the US president. And he issued an incredibly prescient speech in 1961 that speaks to this issue of how our military, and what he described as a military-industrial congressional complex, ultimately came to threaten not just our rights and liberties, as he forecasted, not just our democracy, as he forecasted, but also the future of life on this planet. And I want to get there by remixing some comments offered by another figure by whom I've been inspired since, and that's the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King. At around the same time that Eisenhower was warning us that this creation that he was responsible for, an arms industry, which was necessary to meet the needs of the Second World War and overcome the Nazis, Eisenhower said in 1961, this thing I had to create, it's dangerous. It will transform the country if we let it. He described the spiritual impact of the arms industry on the United States at the municipal level. Think about that for a minute. What does it mean as a president to say that an initiative is going to transform the spiritual character of every town in the country? That's what he said, and he meant it. What he meant basically is that the flag would come to mean different things. There was an era in US history where our flag might have stood for instance, in 1870, maybe it would have stood for racial liberation, right? In 1949, maybe it would have stood for international human rights. Eisenhower warned us that it would come to stand for different things if we weren't knowledgeable and alert. And the year is now 2020. And what our flag stands for is democracy at the barrel of a gun, so-called democracy at the barrel of a gun, forced resource plunder, including fossil fuel extraction, even over the objection of governments and communities who we are taking it from, and state violence. That's what our flag has increasingly come to stand for. And when we think about, over the last 70 years, the pattern in our foreign policy of CIA-driven military interventions in foreign countries, particularly to plunder their resources, and the list of countries that pattern fits is almost too long to name. Just to grip a few off the top of my head, they include the Dominican Republic, Grenada, Nicaragua, Iran, Iraq, I'm blanking. The list goes on. I mean, almost every Colombia, Honduras, Ecuador, nearly every country in Latin America has endured at some point, Chile, U.S. intervention, Cuba, certainly. We have a habit of intervening in foreign countries. And oftentimes we think of that as a foreign policy problem. And the point of Helen's question is that that's not just a foreign policy problem. That's a climate justice problem. Because in two different dimensions, it is both the case that the US Department of so-called Defense is the largest institutional source of carbon pollution on our planet, meaning that we burn more carbon protecting ourselves or asserting US interests and projecting them around the world than any other enterprise on the entire planet. And in addition to burning that much carbon, more than anything else, we also use our military-industrial complex to extract more from the ground. The perfect example of this, just to connect the dots between climate justice and our abusive, belligerent, xenophobic foreign policy, which is bipartisan, incidentally, a perfect example is Iran. In Iran, in 1953, the country attempted to nationalize its oil fields, saying that US and UK oil companies were no longer welcome to monetize their petroleum resources. And in response, the US engineered a coup put in place a brutal dictator who then 20 years later inspired a right-wing revolution. And that's the Iran that we have come to know since. And when we rewind the tape in each of these cases where we have foreign policy antagonists around the world, often it stems from a root of a nationalistic attempt to challenge the US hegemony and claim to natural resources that, just to be very clear here, are not ours to claim. And I'll even go beyond that. I think natural resources generally are no one's to claim. Anytime we allow resource extraction, even when it doesn't include a military industrial complex and violence and death, any resource extraction plunders the future. Those are resources that we did not earn, and those are resources that we do not own, but those are resources that are claimed by corporations to fill the pockets of particular people. And none of us should be willing to go along with that, especially when in our names, in order to enable that extraction and that hijacking of our commons, there is violence using our resources and our tax dollars. I find that particularly objectionable. Resource extraction is bad enough. When it's forced resource extraction, in a democracy, unfortunately, we are all complicit. And I do see certainly the goal of climate justice requiring much more than a complete transition to 100% renewable energy. Energy policy is a big part of securing climate justice. Rationalizing our foreign policy has to be as well. And ultimately, unless we shrink and gain control over these institutions that have run amok and don't answer to any civilian authority, we can't claim to have met the needs of the future.
Wow, thank you.
Thank you, Shahid. That was very insightful. So Aoife, who's a White Cat organizer, asked a question. She said, San Francisco has seen a shift in its culture and the city's makeup over the past few decades with the rise of the technology industry and the gentrification that has come with it. How can economic and social justice work to protect the cultural history and communities of San Francisco and cities across the country?
Nice. I'm appreciating the intersectional dialogue because that's so, in some respects, far afield from climate, but also inextricably related to it. We see here in San Francisco a very similar pattern that many cities around the country are grappling with. And it's a pattern that relates to a predatory, speculative real estate market driving displacement and driving gentrification. And San Francisco has had a brutal experience with this dynamic over the last 20 years. We used to have a very, very diverse community. And in some respects, we still do. We have substantial Latino populations. We have substantial Asian populations. We have substantial populations of people who define our sexual preferences and orientations in our own terms. We have a very increasingly diminished, just a vanishing Black population. And it's frankly a problem. And it reflects the inhospitability in our cities to residents of real estate markets that privilege the interests of speculators over residents. Now, when we think about social justice activists and opportunities to defend our communities and ensure that people get to stick around, I think of activism aimed at ensuring housing equity and housing justice as among the most, the longest levers to ensure that continuing inclusion. A quick shout out to Moms for Housing here in the Bay Area and all the different groups that are doing work to guard the rights. For instance, San Francisco Tenants Union is one of the groups that have endorsed us. There's a statewide organization, Tenants Together. They're doing important work to ensure that tenants know their rights and also to expand the set of tenants' rights. So for instance, here in San Francisco, it was just a few years ago, we adopted the first of its kind in the country, a reform allowing people facing eviction to have access to publicly funded civil representation. It's long been the case since the 60s that if you were charged with a crime in the United States, you have a constitutional right to a lawyer paid for by the government. San Francisco, and as far as I know, New York is the only other city to this point to follow our lead, have taken local decisions to say that not only will criminal defendants have access to publicly funded lawyers, but also people who are facing eviction from their homes will also have lawyers to try to keep them from ending up homeless. And that's an important initiative that we can see federally. That's one thing I would like to take to Washington, to take to Congress as a proposal to fund civil representation for people around the country who are facing eviction. That's the kind of campaign that can make a big difference in the lives, not just of individuals and families, but of entire communities in cities across the country. And in terms of things that we can do at the community level to get there, I often, whether it's climate justice, whether it's racial justice, whether it's police violence, whether it's housing equity, the tools for organizing at their essential root are very much the same. And they include proactively curating your news sources so you can trust what you're learning and not being hoodwinked and gaslit, to connecting with your neighbors to share information and set common plans. A lot of people fall off the train at different points. It's important to get independent information, or to get information independently. It's also important to have dialogue. If you don't connect and dialogue, not just with random abstract people, but people that you can collaborate with, people that are within reach. And that act of discourse, when it then reaches the point of forming common plans, that's what enables all the different things, for instance, that you all are doing. That's what enables climate strikes. That's what enables direct action. That's what enables policy advocacy. That's what enables legislative advocacy. That's what enables electoral campaigns. All the things that we can do as a movement start with small numbers of people having conversations about their shared concerns and setting plans in place together. That's what I'd ultimately recommend to folks. And it's one of the reasons why I'm so inspired by the youth activists around the country doing this important work, because I see you all doing that in 50 different directions all the time. And so, just a quick shout out to all of you doing it. And if anybody's looking for a way to get involved, it all starts there, having these conversations with people you can reach. And I presume that people on the call are connected to local groups where they're coming from. If anybody is not, I would just encourage you to reach out to a climate strike group in your community, or any of the other organizations and networks that are doing climate justice activism. Many of them have networks around the country, and I'm very eager to do what we can to help amplify their messages, connect our volunteers to those frontline groups, and once I have the opportunity to represent my city in Congress, to represent those concerns in the House of Representatives.
And kind of more on that, on your platform of revolution, that's kind of a lot which you run on, but how do you plan to avoid playing into the electoral system and continue that movement once you're in office?
Yes, that is ultimately the million-dollar question. I think we have, as a movement, seen so many people go to Washington in whom we might have hopes. I remember hearing a presidential candidate in 2007 speak in Washington, D.C. about how all change comes from the grassroots. And I remember thinking to myself, I've never heard a presidential candidate talk like that. And when Barack Obama went to Washington, I had some hope. And, it didn't last very long, because unfortunately his aspirations, or at least stated aims, fell very quickly on the shoals of the Washington establishment. And maybe I'd tell a quick story, and maybe that's less relevant, just to the question you raised and how I plan to stay independent and true to my roots when I go to Washington. I'll put it to you this way. I've been in Washington twice before. I've spent a decade there. I went in 2003 to fight the right wing. While I was there, I did the work, for instance, advancing marriage equality that I did, defending campaign finance regulations. I was on the board of the Washington Peace Center. I went back to Washington again after I'd returned to San Francisco for a few years. And in that time slice, I led the Bill of Rights Defense Committee. Over the course of the time that I've been in Washington, I've seen any number of opportunities to do the easier thing for the sake of political expediency, and I've just never done it. I've walked away from money multiple times. When I went to law school, I'd been working basically for a series of investment banks in Chicago. That's how I got my undergrad degree, was going to school at night while working for Wall Street during the day. I got to see the precursors of the 2008 financial crisis. I saw the house of cards on which the derivatives market, for instance, was built. And when I left law school, I worked for a San Francisco law firm in the nation's capital. And I left that work to join a nonprofit. I had a 60% pay cut at the time. I've not, at really any point, put my career in front. And I think that's what drives people in Washington to make these sordid compromises, is the seeming compulsion to protect their careers. And I'm not a careerist at all. If I was a careerist, I'd still be at EFF. My job at the Electronic Frontier Foundation, it was a fun job. It was rewarding. It was very stimulating. I love my colleagues. It was very secure. What I'm doing now is also, very fun. I feel very gratified and grateful for it, but it's anything but secure, right? I mean, I'm running for office against the most powerful corporate politician on the planet. It's the furthest thing from secure. And so if my career was the thing that I was concerned about, I never would have entered this race in the first place. And it's because I'm concerned about principle, and I'm concerned about the future. I'm concerned about people who are too young to vote today, and people who aren't even here yet to defend themselves. the generation 7 hence that we're taught by indigenous wisdom to keep in the forefront of our minds as we're making important decisions today. And that motivation for me is very much also inhered in both my identity and my experience as an immigrant to this country. I was talking before about how I take not for granted, but very seriously, things that I think a lot of Americans take for granted. Among those things is the viability of a future. I know what it's like when a future feels unviable. When I had to leave college the first time because my family lost our home to foreclosure. And so between experiencing housing insecurity and having to struggle for my undergrad degree financially, I understand struggle. I know what our empire looks like from underneath the boot. And I feel a great deal of privilege in having had the opportunities to study at the places I have and work on the campaigns that I have and, fought the court cases that I've had and, do the battles that I have. All of that is driven by a recognition that my privileges are not mine to exploit. I think there's a pretense in some communities that you eat what you kill. And I'm not here either to fight for myself, and nor was I sent here to do battle on my own. I recognize all of the sacrifices, for instance, that my parents and forebears made just for the opportunity for me to be in this country. I recognize, the contributions of my teachers, both in formal educational settings and all my mentors in the social justice struggles that I've been a part of, and all the, trust and support that they've put and invested in me. I'm not going to Washington to advance my career. I'm going to Washington to represent a set of principles and people, frankly, that have long been powerless. Washington has an allure, and the allure is power, but I'm not interested in power. I'm attracted to politics for the principle. And I could talk more, but I think that just gives you at least a little bit of a sense of what's driving my candidacy, why I do the work I do. And I certainly don't think, anybody in Washington has negative intentions or ill will. But at the end of the day, I think a lot of people in Washington are there for themselves, and I'm not going for myself.
Thank you so much. So this one is from the Q&A box. Considering U.S. imperialism has a direct effect on the environment, how will you ensure that we can stand against war with Iran when elected to office?
Well, the first piece here is congressional oversight, checks and balances. So the Constitution restrains the executive branch. It explicitly denies the executive branch war-making authority for a reason. When the Constitution was written, we were revolting from a monarchy, and Congress has the power to assert war and declare it for a reason, because that's not supposed to rest in the hands of an individual. That's supposed to be a deliberative calculus. That's what the founders set up. Congress has repeatedly, particularly over the last 70 years, done everything it can to give that power to the executive branch. And there is one member of Congress, in my mind, who far and away beyond the rest demonstrates a long-standing service to the executive branch and executive unilateralism. Her name is Nancy Pelosi. And the first part here is seeking secrets. The executive branch leverages secrecy to do any number of things, including, for instance, commit international human rights abuses, drag us into foreign wars. And so many of the interventions I was talking about before in Latin America, particular, were interventions conducted under the cover of executive secrecy. Congress is supposed to be, constitutionally, it's constructed to be antagonistic to the executive branch. Congress is supposed to have, if not an outright adversarial relationship, at least one in constructive tension. And a lot of that relates to the congressional oversight function. Congress is supposed to not only control the purse strings, but after appropriating money to executive branch agencies, conduct ongoing oversight to ensure that it's spent responsibly. And there have been failures at all different points in this equation. Let's talk about first spending, then we'll talk about oversight. Spending. The Pentagon was audited recently. I will say, in the manner that a stopped clock is right twice a day, maybe the only thing that this corrupt criminal president has done that I can actually support is commission an audit of the Pentagon, which preposterously none of his predecessors had done in generations. That audit revealed that the Department of so-called Defense has lost track of $21 trillion in the last decades. And I just want people to even try to grip how much money that is. The entire amount of student debt in the United States is under $2 trillion. We're talking about 10 times the amount of student debt that is effectively indentured an entire generation. 10 times that amount of money our military has lost track of. That is absolutely imbecilic. And there's no reason Congress should be appropriating historically high military budgets given that background. Nancy Pelosi very recently supported Trump's most recent military budget. There's never been a military increase that she has not supported. And that's an absolute, setting aside, there's lots of different dimensions here. One just easy part to grip here is that money we're spending on the Pentagon is money we are not putting into renewable energy, right? Just a direct piece. And then, of course, the money we're putting in the Pentagon is also going towards further climate pollution and the use of carbon, and then its further extraction in terms of these interventions. We talked about that dynamic before. So there's lots of different ways in which these appropriations, just the spending patterns, fuel the dynamic. And so the first thing we can do to diminish this unfortunate plundering of the future is to restrain the spending, to limit I don't want to just say limit future increases. I want to reduce the military budget substantially. We have an entirely unjustifiable presence in dozens of countries abroad, and I don't think our military bases abroad enhance U.S. national security. Our biggest national security threats at the moment are the post office closing, which would keep us from having an election, a pandemic, and climate chaos. You can't fight any of those things with military bases. You can't fight any of those things with fancy fighter planes. You can't fight any of those things with nuclear weapons. Why are we wasting hundreds of billions of dollars a year on nuclear weapons, fancy fighter planes, and foreign bases? We have real national security threats. None of those are it. Those were yesterday's national security threats. I'm interested in meeting the needs of tomorrow, not trying to deal with yesterday's problems, decades after the fact. Beyond spending, oversight comes to mind. I want to give a particular shout out here to one member of Congress by whom I've been especially inspired over the last congressional session. I've been so deeply impressed, frankly amazed by Representative Ilhan Omar. I don't know if anybody else saw her cross-examine Elliott Abrams. There's a Reagan administration veteran who was appointed by President Trump as our supposed envoy to Venezuela. And this man is up to his neck in human rights violations. And apparently for 30 years, no one had seen fit to ask him about it, but it took a refugee in Congress to ask this man why we, the people of the United States, should believe even a single word out of his mouth when he's been so unfortunately complicit in sustained human rights abuses in the past. Many of those human rights abuses continue in the present, particularly because there is a continuing cover-up, specifically addressing CIA torture by none other than, once again, House Speaker Nancy Pelosi. She was read into CIA torture in 2006, did nothing about it. And it's one thing to say that we tortured some folks. That's how Barack Obama reduced it. The failure to seek accountability is a continuing violation of international law. We didn't just violate international law when we tortured people. We violate international law again every day that we refuse to conduct the investigation and bring forward the long overdue prosecutions to vindicate human rights. That's an oversight failure. So at the same time that we have to restrict the money going into the Pentagon and fueling these wars for plunder, we also need to conduct oversight and hold officials accountable, particularly when they commit abuses of international human rights. That's been the story of every armed intervention everywhere. We've committed international human rights violations in Afghanistan, in Iraq. We would in Iran if we go to war there. We certainly would in Venezuela if we go to war there. People might not realize that our president is rattling sabers both with Venezuela and Iran in the middle of a pandemic of all godforsaken things. I mean, it's so horrifying, frankly. And maybe I'll make that point too. That's not just our criminal president's fault. I will lay at Nancy Pelosi's feet all of that, because there are lots of things here. One, she has actively supported his foreign policy, including its belligerent militaristic aspects. And I think people know that there was eventually an impeachment process, even if it took her a year to show up for it. I wrote the case and the explanation for how to impeach the president based on his corruption. the nation's leading authority on constitutional law. His name is Lawrence Tribe. He's a retired law professor at Harvard. He shared it virally. It was probably the thing I have written in my life that was read more widely than anything else. And it explained why if you impeach the president for corruption, it unlocks GOP votes in the Senate because conservative voters are as concerned about corruption as progressive and liberal voters are. In fact, conservative voters are more outraged by corruption. There is nothing that alarms them more and gets them more frustrated than the idea of their tax dollars being misdirected and taken by a corrupt central authority. And if the impeachment process were about all of the ways in which our tacky criminal president is stealing from you and your families, that would unleash a wave of conservative, grassroots populist concern that could put in play GOP senators. Nancy Pelosi did not do that. She sought a very different process that would hold the president accountable for inviting foreign interference in a US election. She said that would be the easy thing to explain. It was not. It was a partisan crime. It won no votes in the Senate, and our criminal president is still in office as a result, which is to say, the reason Trump is still the president is because Nancy Pelosi failed to hold him accountable when she had the chance. And it's not a failure that I am willing to look the other way on. I'm not going to give her credit for showing up late for a process that she then limited, snatching defeat from the jaws of victory. I see the saber rattling with Iran as absolutely a failure of our criminal president and his controlled theatrical opposition in the House.
Thank you for that. So our next question is from one of our participants. So Wendy says, hi, college student from Massachusetts, currently at home in Michigan.
Okay.
My class is having us attend events and write response papers to them. So she found this through a friend and is odd and is wishing you good luck. And she says that the Green New Deal was mentioned in the description. So if you have spare time to discuss how that fits into your plan, she would appreciate it. You said that switching to renewables wasn't enough. So beyond switching to renewables, what do you have in mind?
Yeah, great question. And we talked about some of it, the foreign policy intersection with the Pentagon and making sure that we're not, again, just to reprise that, hurling money at a sordid set of international human rights abuses that exacerbate climate chaos, enhancing oversight and ensuring accountability. Those are some of the things beyond renewables. Other aspects of the Green New Deal, though, that are firmly established within it, let me sketch this out. If we're talking here about 100% renewables, and here we're talking about the intersection with the military industrial issues, there's a bigger part of the Green New Deal that's bigger than just renewables, but doesn't necessarily get us to the Pentagon issues. Let's talk about some of those. The most important one in my mind is the just transition and the federal jobs guarantee. We have seen historically in the United States that efforts to improve sustainability in our public policy have sometimes met with political concerns driven by particularly industrial interests, sometimes labor, that have concerns about economic opportunities. And that's why the just transition is so important. The just transition ensures that people and communities that have long been reliant on fossil fuel related enterprises, that they get a chance to participate in the green future. As long as they are given a choice between, we are going to either continue what we've been doing and you can have food on your table, or we're going to have a new industrial paradigm and there are not going to be opportunities for you, that's going to lead us in a predictable, unfortunate place. But when we create opportunities for people in the new economy, that can help break the partisan political logjam that has prevented environmental sustainability from being at the center of our policy calculus. Another way of putting that is that the just transition means that coal miners in West Virginia can vote for the Green New Deal too. There are opportunities for them in the measure, because it's not just about a transition to 100% renewables, it's a transition to 100% renewables with job training and workforce development opportunities to make sure that people can continue to put food on their table as we march into the green future. The green future, when we move to 100% renewables, when we move, reinforce regenerative agriculture and rationalize, for instance, farm subsidies are another vital aspect of public policy that need to be considered when we envision a more sustainable alternative. The Green New Deal, in my mind, also includes refashioning agricultural subsidies so that they're not going primarily to large multinational companies, but instead being channeled to small family farms. That's a good example of another reform like dismantling the Pentagon that's outside the Green New Deal, but plays a very crucial intersectional role in securing climate justice. Another part of the Green New Deal, just to put wheels on the legs of the car and illustrate what it might look like here in California, the federal jobs guarantee is a long-standing aspiration of socialists. And it's incredibly important because it ensures that people will have opportunities, and it will ensure that people can be self-directed in terms of how they work. So one of the needs in California, particularly, that climate chaos has made increasingly urgent is the need to replicate indigenous forest management techniques. We have catastrophic wildfires across our state every year, driven by a drought and water boom cycle. And indigenous communities practice very labor-intensive forest management techniques that we have resigned and we haven't practiced in over a century. That's incredibly labor-intensive work. The market isn't going to reward it. There's no profit motive in clearing underbrush from fires to make sure that when wildfires happen, that they don't become these catastrophic conflagrations that burn entire cities to the ground. That's what a federal jobs guarantee can unlock, is an opportunity for a generation to replicate these labor-intensive, not market lucrative forest management techniques. And that kind of industrial retooling to make sure that our labor resources are going to meet our needs instead of just to fill people's pockets. That's the part of the Green New Deal that I'm the most inspired by. It's the transition to renewables. It's the ensuring that people can participate and thrive in the future. And it is this idea of particularly creating a guarantee that people can have employment and that can create these opportunities to meet the climate resiliency projects that our communities are going to need to embrace, especially as climate chaos proceeds.
Okay, thank you so much for your very lengthy answer. We have learned a lot so far. So our next question is,
I'm sorry if I'm droning on. I know these are lengthy answers.
No. We learned a lot and we really enjoy like everything we talked about so far. So this kind of goes back to Priyanka's question, but not as much like a focus on careerists, opportunists. It's more on like revolution. So how would you reconcile the concept of a political revolution with electoral politics when electoral politics is inherently hierarchical? And is your campaign, is it meant to further or aid the revolution, or would it like be separate from the revolution? Would it even like harm the revolution? So yeah, we were just wondering.
Great questions. I love it. And that's particularly one I don't get a chance to address very often because, in an electoral arena, that particularly doesn't come up. The revolution that I aim to support is a generational one. And I want to make sure that we have a revolution that places voices that are aware of today's problems in seats that we can make decisions about them. And I see this know-nothing governance that preceded us as a threat, frankly, to the continuation of our species. And that's not a political revolution, that's more a social revolution. When I think about the tension between electoral activism and traditional forms of revolution, one of them is the relationship conceivably, and this isn't inherent in revolution, but there have been any number of nonviolent revolutions, but revolutions are often violent. And I am a nonviolent person. And so that's one basis for my dedication to electoral activism. As a Muslim as well, frankly, there have been entire zones of political discourse that are just not viable for us to contend. And any discussion of armed force is just not one in which I've felt a liberty to engage. And so that's not where my mind is at, and it's not where I've been at. I've also seen through our work, short of revolution, our work in the courts, our work in policy, I've seen civil rights expand. Gay people can get married to a partner of their choice and have families today because we have been able to secure civil rights through non-revolutionary means. Now, I think about revolutions outside the methodological context as seeking a set of substantive aims. Those are the same substantive aims I'm taking to Congress. They include making sure that every American has a roof over their head and food in their stomachs, establishing human rights to shelter, food, and housing, and healthcare and education, expanding our human rights to include our various human needs. I think of that as a very revolutionary concept. Now, I'm doing it methodologically through an electoral track, and then there's going to have to be a subsequent legislative phase, but in no way, in my mind, is that not revolutionary. And I certainly think it supports the goals of revolution to seek in policy their realization. I see the democracy offering a more humane alternative to force. I think that's what has made it compelling in the modern world. I see our democracy in the United States as having been co-opted by corporate capital, which is why it's been so predatory and vicious. But I do think the opportunity to make our democracy accountable to the people again creates an opportunity for us to recover substantive principles, including equity, sustainability, opportunity for everyone, that might sound revolutionary if they were pursued through other means. So just to try to sum that up, substantively, I think our campaign is profoundly revolutionary. Methodologically, it's not, and that's because I think democracy is a superior alternative to revolution. I do think that we ultimately face the struggle of democratizing this country because we falsely, frankly, claim to be a democracy. I think we falsely claim to be free. You know, you're free in the United States to spend all your money on cancer treatment and die in the street. You're free in the United States to be shot by a cop. You know, you're not free in the United States to get a meal if you're hungry. Like what freedom means here, I think, is a very twisted simulacrum of the word. And ultimately our campaign and the goals of revolution is to achieve paradigm shifts in these principles, to liberate. And I am a post-colonial liberation agent, and I do seek a liberatory policy through an electoral process.
Thank you so much for that very illuminating answer. And I like how you make the distinction between the campaign's revolutionary and aspect and the substance of it. And super illuminating for me. My next question is also about your campaign. What's the major turning point in your campaign that needs to happen for you to actually win the seat? Because as she is so established and incredibly well-funded, if you could make one major event happen that could, in essence, mark the beginning of the end for Pelosi, or what does your campaign see as a way to achieve that, especially with COVID-19, the grassroots, our strength is ground game?
Great questions. So I'd actually have two different answers in terms of what needs to happen versus a pivotal event. The event, if I were to construct an event, is a debate. Nancy Pelosi hasn't debated a challenger in 30 years. And where I come from in the United States, you might describe that as not showing up for work. That's what candidates for public office are supposed to do. You debate your ideas, you defend your ideas in public. And as an incumbent with a 30-year voting record, I would hope that she would feel the responsibility to answer to the constituents for her votes. And she relies to a large extent on a corporate media depiction of her that flies in the face of the reality. And the fact of the matter is that her voting record can't withstand an informed critique, which is precisely why I don't expect her to show up for a debate today, having refused over the last 30 years to do that. The turning point for our campaign, we're frankly right around it, and it is the launch of distributed phone banking technology and infrastructure that enables anyone anywhere to identify and persuade San Francisco voters on our behalf. And we just launched those tools, in fact, in the last week. And when the pandemic first hit, most of our field game was focused on door knocking and campaign events, bringing people together, getting volunteers on the street, knocking on people's doors, sharing the campaign with them, meeting face to face. And obviously the pandemic shuts down all of those traditional campaign tactics. So it really makes phone outreach doubly important and also opportune for two reasons. One, as long as people are sheltering in place, they're at home. So we found that the phone response rates are much higher than they were before the pandemic hit. Two, because people are at home, not just here in San Francisco, but around the country, there's a much broader volunteer pool available to make the phone calls than there are to knock on the doors, just because we have so much support from around the country. So we currently have hundreds of people making phone calls for us. We will soon be growing into thousands of people making phone calls for us. On Bernie's campaign for the White House, many of us were making calls to different states. And that's a lot of ground to cover. A whole state is a lot. And it wasn't just one, it was lots of states. And most of the time when we were calling a particular state for Bernie, we only had a few weeks. We still have over 6 months, and our district is no larger than a single city, which is to say we have plenty of time and plenty of hands to, if not knock on the doors during a time of pandemic, at least ring the phones to make those connections, to let San Franciscans know that we have a real choice, to let San Franciscans know that we have a choice between a servant of corporate power and executive power who has undermined issues including sustainability and climate justice for decades, versus a choice who has stood with our communities, confronted institutional power, and seeks climate justice and racial justice and economic justice. And I think with the time we have left and all the support that we have, especially armed with these new tools that we just launched, allowing anyone anywhere to sign up to make calls for us, if I can just shout that out, feel free to join us. You can sign up online at shahid.fyi/volunteer, or you can just visit our webpage, shahidforchange.us, and click the volunteer button in the top nav. It'll take you to the same place. But again, hundreds of people are making phone calls for us already. We're looking forward to that community growing into the thousands. And that distributed support, that artillery, you might say, from outside the district is going to be a crucial part of how we're going to win the race.
Thank you. I really liked how you incorporated everyone and us so that we can volunteer for you. This last question.
Not for me, for us.
Oh, for us. Sorry. Okay, this last question is kind of like a wrap up. Looking beyond your platform, what is your pie in the sky environmental or social dream? Like what environmental policies or practices that seem impossible now should be a commonplace by 2040?
That's a great question. I don't want to say that I wouldn't defer these to 2040 because I hope they happen sooner. The first one I wouldn't describe as a pie in the sky. I think this is imminently reachable. Here in San Francisco, we have a municipal composting program. It's painless. You have food scraps, they go in a different bin, the city collects them once a week. And that helps regenerate soil, which has all kinds of positive externalities, for carbon sequestration, for reducing and reusing, organic material. There's no reason that's just a municipal program, right? So I'd like to take to Congress a proposal to create grants for any state to replicate that kind of public composting opportunity. That's simple, that's a no-brainer. The pie in the sky idea for me, and I don't think frankly it can wait till 2040, because if it takes us that long, I don't know if we're all going to be here to talk about it, but that's nationalizing fossil fuel extraction companies. This is what got Iran invaded in 1953, right? When you start tinkering with corporate profit, people aren't very happy sometimes because capital has a great deal of influence. But at the end of the day, capital and I will use the word slavish devotion to it, capital is killing us already. It's not a future phenomenon. It's not a far off fear. It is already here. And we can't be committed to capital when human lives are on the line. And at the end of the day, mining, drilling inherently prey on the future. There's no good reason for us to incentivize through the market resource plunder. And the market is a creation of the legal regime. There's no reason we can't pass a law saying, in the same way that you can't sell your vote, that you can't sell things that you pull out of the ground. If you pull it out of the ground, pay somebody for it first, like the commons, and then maybe sell it. But don't just take it from all of us and then spew it into the air and force the future to deal with it. That's just such profoundly irresponsible economic behavior enabled by equally irresponsible political choices. And those are political choices that we can make differently. And I'm eager to make those different decisions.
Okay, thank you. I think that's all we have.
I'll just thank you guys for having me on. I'm so
thank you so much.
To be with you. Keep up the great work. I'm so inspired by all of your activism and your organizing. And whether it's my campaign this November, whether it's another campaign that you find to plug into, I just encourage all of you to find a way, both through your efforts and through other channels also, for your concerns to take expression. The future needs us all. And I'm grateful to stand alongside you in defending it today.
Thank you so much for talking with us and teaching us a lot of really cool history. And we definitely are proud to stand alongside you as well. And yeah, we definitely all want to get involved, and all the other amazing down ballot races from the president as well. We got to get progressive politics in. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Keep up the great work. Thanks, everybody. Take care.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.